Good evening, everyone. I thank God for giving me this opportunity to share this Bible study with you all on the theme Discipleship and Suffering. Before we go any further, let us look to God in prayer. Dear God, as we are going to spend this time meditating upon your word, may the words of my mouth and meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock, our redeemer. During this lockdown period, starting from the end of March, we were all confined to our home, and all of us struggled to understand the problems and challenges brought to us by this pandemic. One thing that troubled me so much is the constant news and stories of suffering from different parts of our own country. In fact, we are surrounded by stories of suffering, not only from our own country, but from different parts of the world. We have stories of wars, stories of violence, stories of brutality, stories of migrants struggling to reach their home, people dying on the way towards their house, and people crying on the street, small children walking barefoot. And also, we have experienced so much of violence and brutality, making people to face suffering in their own life. Witnessing stories of suffering and tragedy made me to think deeply about the question of suffering. Some of us struggle alone, suffer alone. Some of us suffer as family, and some of us suffer as a community. When we are faced with so much of pain and struggles, we are often asked, why does God allow such pain and suffering? Why should innocent people suffer so unjustly around the world? Like many of us, Prophet Habakkuk was also deeply disturbed by the violence of cruel Babylonians and asks God, why are you silent while they destroy people who are more righteous than they are? If you read Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 2 to 4, says, O Lord, how long must I call for help before you listen, before you save us from violence? Why do you make me see such trouble? How can you stand to look on such wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are all around me, and there is fighting and quarreling everywhere. The law is weak and useless, and justice is never done. Evil people get the better of the righteous, and so justice is perverted. And like many of us who are struggling with the question of suffering, Habakkuk seems to ask the question why God seems to be silent, why God did not do anything to stop the suffering. Is God weak and powerless? We are not only surrounded by stories of suffering, but many of us have experienced or continue to experience suffering and tragedy in our own life. The life story of Job in the Bible is a story of very deep suffering and tragedy. Job lost everything. He lost his wealth, lost his dignity and status, he lost all his children, at last he lost his own physical health. And Job was left without any hope. If we read Job chapter 2, verse 9, his own wife tells to Job like this: are you still faithful as ever? Why don't you curse God and die? Job's personal suffering and tragedy is very unimaginable. Like Job, many of us as individuals and families, we are also confronted with personal struggles, problems, sufferings, and tragedies. Sufferings, especially during this time of pandemic. Many people, many families are struggling because The father or the mother have lost their job, lost their business, or maybe they have lost their loved ones to the pandemic. And many other families are struggling to balance their work and balance their responsibility at home. Some are struggling with illness, and many are left without any hope. When faced with or surrounded by unbearable sufferings, our usual response is to become angry or frustrated, or sometimes we say, why no one is doing anything to stop this suffering? Or sometimes we are gripped with fear at the face of the power of evil. Or sometimes we become numb and accept the suffering as a reality, or become accustomed to the suffering. Or sometimes we become hopeless. We give up hope as there is no foreseeable end to our suffering. And sometimes we question the existence of God. In our Bible study today, we are going to reflect upon how, as disciples of Christ, we should respond to suffering. First, suffering to avoid. Second, suffering to confront. And third, suffering to bear. Let us look at an example of suffering which we need to avoid. The first reason for suffering, the suffering that we might face, is it can be caused by our own mistakes. The biblical example of suffering caused by one's own mistake can be seen in the example of prodigal son, found in Luke chapter 15, verse 11 to 32. In the example of the prodigal son, the young son disobeyed his father. He wanted to live his life as he wanted. Probably his father might have told him, okay, why do you want to take all the property and why do you want to sell the property? But he wasted it, disobeyed his father, and wasted all his wealth in reckless living. As a consequence of his own mistake, he was facing hunger, he was facing poverty, and he was suffering. Sometime in our own life also, we might face suffering because of our own mistakes. We might struggle because of our own mistakes. For example, if there is a speed limit for our vehicle, if we consciously, after knowing that there will be a fine or there will be some kind of a punishment when we break a traffic rule, if we still do it and then we get caught, we get uh, a punishment or we get a fine for our own mistake. Similarly, in our own life also, we can face suffering because of our own mistakes. If we are facing suffering in our own life, or if suffering is caused by our own mistake, sometimes it can be caused by our own unhealthy choices that we make in our life, just like the prodigal son. Then the only way out of it is to turn back, repent, and come back to God who is ready to forgive and accept us. Like the prodigal son was accepted by his most gracious father, our God is willing to accept us. So that by coming back to our God, by seeking forgiveness, we can come out of our own suffering. Secondly, suffering can be caused by reasons or forces outside our own self, unlike the first example that we saw, where the suffering is caused by our own choices, but our own mistakes. But here, there are other larger forces or reasons in our life, in the society. For example, corruption, bias based on gender, religion, caste, race, and inequality in society can also cause suffering in the life of an individual, a family, or even a community. This is a suffering that we need to confront. In the story of the rich man and Lazarus, found in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31, we can see the rich man was dressed in expensive clothes and lived a very luxurious life. whereas Lazarus was covered with sores. Sitting at the door of the rich man, he hoped to fill his stomach with bits of food that fell from the rich man's table. Even dogs would come and lick the sores that Lazarus had in his body. Ultimately, Lazarus dies and is taken by angel to sit beside Abraham and to feast in heaven. Whereas the rich man too dies, but was taken to the Hades place where the dead people are. Lazarus dies in poverty and pain, but enters eternity with joy and peace. Rich man lives his life in luxury and wealth, but is condemned to hell. Probably the rich man was condemned to hell because he failed to confront the suffering of Lazarus, and he was indifferent to the suffering that Lazarus was facing. This reminds us that we should also care for the people who are suffering around us, especially during this time of pandemic. As disciples of Christ, we must not be indifferent to the plights, needs, and suffering of people around us. When we are surrounded by people who go through different forms of suffering, it is our Christian responsibility to work for the removal of suffering just as Jesus did during his earthly ministry. Today, there are many people around us who suffer in extreme poverty, like Lazarus, because of the corrupt nature of the society as well as because of the pandemic. During our current lockdown, many people have lost their job and are suffering. Do we ignore the plight of the needy around us, just like the rich man? What kind of discipleship is required of us to confront such suffering that we witness around us? Our first point was a suffering that we have to avoid, and our second point was a suffering that we need to confront. And third, and our final point, the suffering is a cross that we have to bear as disciples of Christ. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the German pastor and theologian who lived during the Second World War, strongly believed that to endure the cross is not tragedy. It is the suffering which is the fruit of an exclusive allegiance to Jesus Christ. In other words, Bonhoeffer believed there is a cost to pay, a suffering to bear as disciples of Christ. He strongly believed that it is only natural if we are disciples of Christ that there will be suffering, that we will suffer. And fruit of our commitment to Christ is suffering. The words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer is very much true, for we have numerous examples of people suffering because of their commitment to Christ. We have so many examples in the Bible as well as in the church history. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 21 to 33, we can see the suffering of Paul. Paul was imprisoned, flogged, exposed to death. 5 into 39 times he was lashed. He was beaten 3 times with rod, once with stone, and 3 times he faced shipwreck. Once he was in open sea, and he was in danger from rivers, bandits, he was danger from Jews and Gentiles. He faced danger in the city, country, and sea, and danger from false believers. And he spent his life without sleep, without food, and without clothing. And his life is a very good example of a disciple of Christ who experienced extreme suffering. Jesus' own disciples faced a lot of suffering. If you see how their life came to an end, except for John, the beloved, disciple of Jesus Christ who had a natural death. All the other disciples of Jesus Christ were martyred. You see, Matthew, he was crucified in Judea. Peter, crucified upside down. And, and if you see Andrew, he was crucified on an X shaped cross. And Bartholomew was flayed and beheaded. Thomas was thrust with a spear. Simon was crucified. Philip was crucified by soldiers. Jude was filled with arrows. And Matthew was stabbed with a sword. And James was stoned to death. The other James was stabbed with a sword. And Apostle Paul was beheaded in Rome. And all of them faced very tragic death, yet they were true disciples of Jesus Christ. Jesus himself suffered a lot. If you read Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, it says, he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And Jesus died a very painful death and humiliating death on the cross because he loved us. Thus, we can say that suffering is an important mark of discipleship. Dietrich Bonhoeffer once again says that Christians become the bearers of burdens, as it is written in Galatians 6:2, bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Just as Christ bears our burdens, so also are we to bear the burdens of our brothers and sisters. Discipleship is commitment to the suffering Christ. And it is very much true that we can definitely say that as disciple of Christ, we have a suffering to bear. On a fateful day, 15 prisoners were lined up to be hanged in a concentration camp. Among the 15 prisoners, one was a very young boy, was hardly 10-year old. As all the prisoners were lined up and the time to hang them came, the officers in that concentration camp, they made all the prisoners to watch that event. All the older people died quickly, whereas the young boy, as his body weight was not heavy, was struggling to die for minutes after minute. The whole crowd was just watching the tragic event was pained deeply. And one person from the crowd shouted, where is God? Where is God? If there is a God, God should intervene. It was such a painful situation. After a few moments of silence, somebody shouted, God is there, God is there, God is there in this boy who is dying. At the end of this Bible study, I would like to leave you all with this verse from Isaiah chapter 63, verse 9. In all their affliction, he was afflicted. This words of Isaiah was written to people who were back from their bondage and they were back in Jerusalem. This is a verse of hope and encouragement for people who have come out of their Babylonian captivity. God told them that you are not alone. God told them that He participated in their suffering. He never left them. In all their suffering, in all their affliction, He was afflicted. Similarly, as disciples of Christ, we may have to go through suffering. Remember, God participates in our suffering. We are not alone. Amen.